I was 72 the night my husband told me that no one cared about old women. It wasn't said in anger or even with malice, just tossed casually between bites of his pork chop as if it were a weather report or some mildly disappointing sports score. No one cares about old women, Maggie. You fade, you wrinkle, and people look right through you. He didn't look up when he said it. He didn't need to. We had been married for 48 years, and in that time, I had learned how to absorb the small cruelties that fell from his mouth like dust off an old book, quiet, persistent, settling into the fabric of our shared life until I barely noticed them anymore. But this time was different. This time, the words didn't settle. They sliced, and something in me, something long dormant and careful, stirred awake with a slow, painful stretch, like a woman rising stiffly from a chair she had sat in for too long. The silence that followed was so normal it hurt. He went back to cutting his meat, and I went back to pretending I had an appetite. But inside me, that sentence began to echo, bouncing off the hollow places I had spent decades wallpapering with routine. Meals, laundry, polite smiles at company events, the occasional vacation that served more as a backdrop for his ego than a space for rest. I had always been Mrs. Holloway, a supporting character in someone else's play. I was well-preserved, they said, well-mannered, well-behaved. But that night, I stared down into the mashed potatoes on my plate and thought, what if I'm more than that? What if I am not done? What if invisibility is a choice they imposed, and one I've agreed to for far too long? After dinner, he went to his recliner, and I went to the kitchen like always. I washed the dishes by hand, another habit he insisted on because machines make people lazy. And with each plate, I thought about the moments I had given away, the years I swallowed my opinions to avoid conflict, the dreams I told myself were silly, the art class I never took, the speech I once rehearsed alone in our bathroom mirror just to feel the power of my own voice. I thought about how, somewhere along the way, I had mistaken survival for silence and compromise for erasure, and I realized, with a strange clarity, that I didn't want to die as the soft-spoken woman who folded towels with military precision but never unfolded her own truth. I didn't make any declarations that night. No cinematic slamming of doors, no shouted monologue to the empty kitchen. Just a quiet decision lodged somewhere behind my ribs. I would take one step, then another, not to punish him, but to reclaim myself. The next morning, while he read the newspaper and complained about the government, I signed up for a local storytelling workshop at the library. It was something I had seen advertised for years, but always dismissed with a quick, maybe next time. This time I clicked register. I didn't tell him, I didn't need to. The act itself was a seed planted in secret, waiting for light. The library smelled like old paper and soft wood polish, a comforting scent from my childhood. There were 10 of us in the workshop, most women, most older. We sat in a circle with hesitant smiles, all of us carrying lives full of quiet battles and invisible victories. The instructor, a wiry man in his 60s with eyes like warm marbles, asked us to write the first line of a story we hadn't told yet. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote, "My husband told me no one cares about old women." When I read it aloud, the room fell silent. Then someone whispered, "Say more." And for the first time in years, I did. That single sentence became a floodgate. I spoke of the ways I had disappeared in plain sight, of the years I had been praised for selflessness when what I really was scared. Scared of taking up space, of being too loud, of wanting too much. But the more I spoke, the less afraid I felt. Each word was a step out of the fog. I began to attend every session, then more storytelling nights at local cafes, then regional events. And somewhere along the way, someone recorded me. A clip went viral. A producer called, and suddenly I was on a plane to New York, invited to share my story on national television, not because I was young, not because I was trendy, but because I dared to say, I'm still here. The morning after the TV segment aired, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and saw a stranger. Not because of age, those lines and silver streaks had been with me for years, but because for the first time, I wasn't looking through my own reflection. I was looking into it. The woman staring back wore the same pale pink robe I'd had since 1998, but there was something new in her eyes, something alert and unflinching. The national audience had seen me as brave, as empowering, as the voice of women who feel forgotten, as one anchor put it. But what startled me most wasn't the public reaction. It was the quiet realization that I had finally heard myself. I had listened without apology or reduction to the sound of my own truth echoing back, and it rang clearer than anything I'd heard in decades. The calls and messages began that same day. Women from across the country, strangers, leaving, voicemails, emails, handwritten letters. Some cried, some cursed, some simply said, "Thank you." One woman, age 81, wrote that she had not spoken above a whisper since her husband died, but after seeing me, she enrolled in a community theater group. Another, in her 50s, left a tearful message saying she finally filed for divorce after 25 years of being told she was too emotional, too dramatic, too much. I listened to these voices and realized I had become something I never set out to be: a mirror. Not the kind that reflects beauty, but the kind that reflects back someone's potential when they've forgotten how to see it in themselves. Of course, not all the reactions were kind. My husband, predictably, called it an embarrassment. He watched the segment from his recliner, arms crossed, his expression a blend of disdain and disbelief. "You made me look like a villain," he said, though I never mentioned him by name. "Why dig up all this personal stuff? Why can't you just age gracefully like other women?" I didn't argue. I didn't even explain. For once I let the silence answer. It wasn't my job to justify my healing to the person who had made the wound. That night, I slept in the guest room, not out of anger, but preservation. The space felt symbolic, like I was drawing a border between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. Over the next few weeks, invitations came. Small events at first, local panels, book clubs, storytelling gatherings, then bigger ones, university talks, women's conferences, a podcast series hosted by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Each time I hesitated before accepting. Each time I reminded myself that I had spent a lifetime deferring, making room for others, speaking only when invited. Now I was being invited not to fill space, but to take it, to own it. My voice, it seemed, had found resonance not in its volume, but in its honesty. And with every retelling of my journey, I felt the invisible cage around my identity weaken, bar by bar, truth by truth. There were moments of doubt, of course. I would stand backstage at these events, my palms clammy, my mind racing. What if I stumbled? What if they saw through me? What if I was nothing more than a brief curiosity, an old woman who got lucky with a viral clip? But then I would see the audience, faces lit with recognition, women leaning forward, waiting not for perfection, but for something real. And so I spoke. Not because I had all the answers, but because I finally had the courage to ask better questions. Who gets to define relevance? Why do we wait until our voices are hoarse to start using them? What if aging isn't disappearance, but emergence? It wasn't fame I was chasing. It was restoration, of worth, of voice, of the parts of myself I had left folded in drawers and locked behind politeness. For every interview, I wore the same simple navy dress, not because I had nothing else to wear, but because it reminded me of who I was when this began. Still, unsure, still fragile, still furious. That dress held memory, and every time I zipped it up, I remembered that night at the kitchen sink, the weight of a single sentence, and the flicker of resistance it lit inside me. I wasn't just on national TV, I was coming home to myself. He never noticed when I stopped folding his socks just the way he liked them. That used to be one of his little rules. Toes together, roll tight, pairs facing up. It sounds small, but it was the kind of detail that had come to define our marriage, order, control, ritual, masquerading as intimacy. At first, I kept doing it out of habit, even after the storytelling began, even after the interviews. But somewhere between the second podcast and my first published op-ed, I started rolling the socks my way, casual, loose, functional. And he didn't say a word. That, somehow, hurt more than his insults, because it meant he had stopped seeing the little things, or worse, had never seen them at all. 48 years of marriage, and he couldn't tell when the patterns shifted. I began to test this invisibility deliberately, not out of spite, but curiosity. I moved his favorite chair slightly off-center. I stopped replenishing the ice tray, a task I'd performed with quiet devotion for decades. I hung a painting in the hallway, one with bold reds and fractured lines, nothing like our muted landscapes, and waited for a reaction. There wasn't one. He read the paper, he watched the news, he asked what was for dinner, and each time he passed by the painting without a glance, I felt something like confirmation. My erasure had never been sudden. It had been gradual, 1,000 unnoticed silences strung together into a life that looked functional from the outside but felt hollow on the inside. I wondered how many other women were living in marriages like mine, equal in theory, unequal in practice. How many of us had traded curiosity for comfort, conversation for coexistence? I remembered the early years, when he used to ask what I was thinking, when he used to listen. But over time, my opinions had become background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator, constant, necessary, but unremarked. It wasn't that I hadn't changed. It was that he had stopped caring if I had. And for a long time, I mistook that indifference for stability. I called it normal. I even defended it to friends. But now, under the bright light of public attention and private reflection, I saw the cracks running deep beneath the surface. The invitations kept coming, but so did the distance between us. One night, I returned from a radio interview in Boston and found him asleep in his chair, the TV flickering over his face. I stood there for a long time, watching him breathe, wondering when the last time was that we had touched without it being accidental. There was no animosity, no dramatic fights, just the slow drift of two people who had built a house together but forgot to build a home. I climbed into bed without waking him and stared at the ceiling for hours, thinking about the difference between solitude and loneliness. I used to fear being alone. Now, I feared being unseen. What surprised me most during that time wasn't how much I missed him. It was how little. The man I missed, I realized, was someone I had imagined. A version of him I had kept alive in my mind to make sense of staying. I missed the idea of being cherished, not the reality of being tolerated. And as I began to give voice to my truth publicly, I discovered that the more honest I became out there, the less I could pretend in here. The home I had once protected so fiercely began to feel like a museum, full of artifacts from a life I no longer inhabited. I kept expecting the grief to come, to crash over me like a wave, but instead, it arrived like fog, slow, quiet, persistent. It touched everything. Then came the moment I had both anticipated and dreaded. The first time he asked me not to go. I was invited to speak at a conference in Chicago, a big one, with journalists and thought leaders, and even a few celebrities. As I packed, he stood in the doorway and said, "You're leaving again?" I turned and met his eyes. "Yes," I said simply. "It matters." He didn't argue. He just nodded and walked away. And as I zipped my suitcase, I realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in our marriage, but in me. I was no longer asking for space. I was taking it. In Chicago, they called me Margaret Holloway, not Maggie, not Mrs. Holloway, and certainly not his wife, just Margaret, clean, strong, whole. It was printed on the badge I wore around my neck, announced over the loudspeaker, written across the placard on the panel table where I sat between a best-selling author and a social psychologist from Stanford. Next up, we welcome Margaret Holloway, whose voice has become a rallying cry for the women America forgot to keep seeing. That was how the host introduced me. I should have felt out of place. The others had publicists, books, teams. I had a suitcase with one good dress and a heart full of stories. But when I stepped onto the stage, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. Because for the first time, I wasn't stepping into someone else's expectations. I was stepping into my own becoming. The room was filled with women of all ages, some young and hungry-eyed, scribbling notes with urgency. Others older, still beautiful but faded at the edges like worn portraits, sitting quietly until something I said made their eyes gleam with sudden fire. I spoke of erasure, of reinvention, of the subtle betrayals women endure when their value is tied to youth or usefulness. I talked about marriage, but more importantly, I talked about silence, the way it molds us, controls us, tricks us into mistaking compliance for peace. When I finished, The applause didn't thunder. It swelled, slow and thick, like something sacred. And in that sound, I felt my name become something new, not just an identifier, but a claim. Margaret Holloway, a woman who decided not to disappear. Backstage, a producer from a national network approached me. She was in her 40s, sharp, efficient, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing. "We're doing a new series," she said, "on transformative voices. I think you'd be perfect for the second episode. Your story resonates far beyond age. It's about power." I blinked. I wasn't used to hearing words like that directed at me. Not power, not voice, not, "You're perfect." I gave her a cautious smile and took the card she offered, fingers trembling slightly. Back at the hotel that night, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at that small rectangle of cardstock, wondering what my younger self would have thought of all this. The girl who once wanted to study philosophy, but was told to find something practical. The woman who had spent decades serving others before she ever dared to serve herself. I called Sophia. She was my oldest friend, more like a sister, really, and the only one who had witnessed both the quiet years and the new ones. She listened without interrupting as I told her about the panel, the applause, the producer. When I paused, she said softly, "You know, you've already done the hard part, right? This is the echo. What you're hearing now is the echo of your courage." Her words hit harder than I expected. I thought I had been brave on stage, in interviews, at the mic, but Sophia was right. The real bravery happened in my kitchen by the sink, the night I didn't cry. It happened when I chose to tell the truth while my hands were still wet from dishwater. Everything since then had just been volume. Returning home after Chicago was like stepping back into grayscale after a weekend in full color. He didn't ask how the trip went. He didn't notice the business card I left on the counter. He didn't say he was proud. And strangely, I didn't expect him to anymore. That part of me, the part that craved his recognition like sunlight, was withering fast. I moved through the house like a visitor, seeing it for what it was, a shrine to his preferences, his opinions, his history. My own fingerprints felt faint, like smudges easily wiped clean. I began to wonder what it would mean to build a space that reflected me, not the quiet Maggie he had curated, but the Margaret the world was beginning to hear. And that's when the idea came, not fully formed, but like a whisper, soft and certain. I needed to leave. Not in anger, not as punishment, but as a reclamation. I had built this life around a man who had once loved me in his own limited way, but who had stopped seeing me a long time ago. Now the world saw me. I saw me. And the contrast was no longer survivable. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need him to notice. What I needed was a life where I wasn't waiting to be noticed at all. I didn't leave with fanfare. There were no suitcases dragged down the steps, no slammed doors or shouted accusations. I left the way some women survive marriages for decades, quietly, methodically, with dignity and a plan. It started with a drawer. One day, I emptied my nightstand and placed the contents in a canvas bag. A journal, a few letters I had never mailed, a photograph of my mother I kept hidden under the drawer lining. He didn't notice. A week later, I moved my grandmother's ring from the jewelry box to my purse. The ring was mine, but he once claimed it was family property. That's when I knew. He believed everything in our home belonged to him, even the parts of me that had never truly been his. The actual move happened on a Thursday morning while he was golfing with his brother. I had planned it that way. No confrontations, no explanations. Sophia came with her hatchback and her fierce kindness. We packed my things with the care of archivists, not burglars. Every book, every photograph, every item I had once questioned the right to call mine was now chosen deliberately. When we finished, I stood in the doorway for a long moment. The living room, with its stiff furniture and unspoken resentments, felt smaller than ever. The walls held no memories I wanted to keep. I left a letter on the kitchen table. Not dramatic, just honest. I am no longer waiting to be seen. I am not angry. I am simply done. Moving into Sophia's guest house was temporary, but it felt like freedom. The space was small, but bright, with a skylight over the bed and a chipped desk that reminded me of the one I wrote on in college before I dropped out to get married. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had buried until I saw my things arranged in a space that had no memory of him. I cried the first night, not because I regretted leaving, but because I felt safe. And in that safety, the grief could finally speak, not about him, but about the version of myself I had sacrificed to stay with him. She was smart, curious, funny. She had good instincts and terrible timing, and for years I had made her sit quietly in the back of my life. In the days that followed, I felt everything and nothing. Liberation didn't arrive in a single wave. It came in pulses. The first time I bought groceries just for me, granola he hated, goat cheese he called pretentious, I felt a giddy thrill. When I took long walks without telling anyone where I was going, the silence felt expansive, not lonely. But there were hard moments too. Nights when I missed the rhythm of a shared space, the comfort of habit, even the illusion of partnership. I learned quickly that freedom doesn't erase history. It just gives you room to rewrite the ending. And I was ready to be the author now. The media requests intensified. My story had grown beyond a segment or a soundbite. Women's magazines wanted full interviews. A publisher reached out. A documentary producer asked if I'd consider letting them follow me for 6 months. It was surreal. At 72, I had more opportunities than I ever did at 32. But with those opportunities came decisions and doubts. What if I became a symbol people tired of? What if my story lost its meaning in the machinery of media? Sophia reminded me, gently and often, you're not here to represent anyone. You're here to tell the truth. Let the truth do the work. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a National Women's Summit, the keynote slot. When the organizer asked for a title, I didn't hesitate. Call it The Year I Came Home to Myself. She paused. Is that metaphorical? I smiled. No, it's literal. I left my husband. Her laugh was soft, almost reverent. We'll print it exactly like that. As I hung up, I looked around my new space. It still smelled of lavender and possibility. I was building something, not just a platform, not just a career at an age when most people retire, but a life, one that was finally mine. The summit was held in a grand theater, red velvet seats, golden moldings, and a stage that had hosted voices far more famous than mine. As I stood behind the curtain, I could hear the crowd murmuring, the soft clatter of coffee cups, the rustle of programs. I closed my eyes and placed a hand over my chest, feeling the heartbeat that, for 72 years, had kept pace through silence, compromise, and now, something closer to clarity. The dress I wore was still the navy one. By now, it was slightly faded, the hem a little frayed, but it had carried me through each public telling of my private unraveling. I didn't need anything new. I wasn't performing, I was testifying. When they called my name, the applause began before I even stepped into the light. I walked to the podium slowly, deliberately, my heels echoing across the wooden stage. The lights were bright but not blinding. I could see faces, hundreds of them, turned upward, expectant. I took a breath and began not with a quote or a preamble, but with the same words I had first spoken in that tiny library workshop. My husband once told me no one cares about old women. A murmur moved through the audience, recognition passing like a breeze. He was wrong. People care. They just need to be reminded how to listen. From there, the words came easily. Not rehearsed, but remembered. I told them about silence, about the invisible agreements women make to keep the peace, about the weight of being good, and the cost of staying small. As I spoke, something happened in the audience that I hadn't seen before. Women began to stand, not in ovation, not yet, but slowly, as if pulled by some internal string, one by one, young, old, middle-aged. Some had tears in their eyes, some clutched notebooks, some simply stood with arms crossed, defiant and unyielding. They didn't cheer, they didn't interrupt, they just stood and bore witness. And in their posture, I saw what I had needed for so long, presence, not validation, not applause, just people who refused to look away. The power of that moment outshone anything I had prepared. I let the silence settle and didn't rush to fill it. I wanted them to feel the weight of what we so often avoid. Afterward, I stood in the lobby as women approached one by one, some to thank me, some to share their own stories. I stayed for hours. At one point, a young producer from a IVE streaming network slipped me a card and whispered, "You're going to change more than lives. You're going to change the narrative." I smiled, but gently refused. I had no interest in becoming a brand. My story wasn't a product, it was a path, and I was still walking it. Later, in the quiet of my hotel room, I thought about the life I had left and the one I was still building. It wasn't glamorous. It was, in many ways, quieter than ever, but it was mine. Every silence now was chosen. Every word spoken, earned. Months passed. I moved into a small apartment not far from Sophia's, painted the walls soft cream, filled the shelves with books and framed prints of wildflowers. I planted herbs in the window box, basil, rosemary, mint, and watched them grow in the morning. Light. I joined a writer's group. I learned how to make Moroccan stew. I flirted with the idea of adopting a cat. I took up photography with an old film camera I found at a flea market. And slowly, my life stopped feeling like a reaction and started feeling like a creation. I wasn't fixing what had broken. I was building what had never been allowed to exist in the first place. Not a new version of myself, but the truest one. The one who had always been waiting for permission, which it turned out she didn't need. One day, while walking home from a reading, I passed a couple arguing in front of a cafe. The woman looked tired in the way I used to. Beautiful, poised, but dimmed. As I passed, I caught a snippet of his voice. "You're too sensitive. No one wants to hear this again." And without hesitation, I turned, gently touched her arm, and said, "Actually, I'd listen." Her eyes widened, her lips parted, but before she could speak, I smiled and walked on. I didn't need to stay. I just needed her to know someone saw her. That might be my life's work now. Not headlines or spotlights, but small revolutions, quiet recognitions, acts of defiant empathy. And when I finally reached my apartment, I took off my shoes, opened the windows, and sat down at my desk, where a single sentence waited for me on the page. She wasn't finished. She was just finally starting.